So then if you become a Buddhist, then of course, not everybody should become monk and nun, right? So that's a kind of also up to the individual, and you shouldn't rush it. Yeah, same for me. It can be just an emotion, kind of, oh wow, you know, kind of a fantasy, kind of, or... It should be grounded in a good understanding of what we call the lamrim, or the stages of the path to enlightenment, right? It should be a general form of renunciation, of understanding the nature of suffering, and understanding that aspect in the sense that you can do something within the monastic kind of life, and it has great benefits to live as a monastic, and that's why I initially thought, you know, that's for me, if you really want to do kind of the full traditional program, and as a monastic there's incredible opportunities. Yeah. To be a monk or nun, then the best is of course if you live in a community, right? Because you need support, especially in the beginning. Yeah. So I've been involved with a project with His Holiness Dalai Lama's private office every year for about 6 years to screen the candidates who take ordination with His Holiness, Westerners, right? And the rules became more strict over the years, and that's important because you don't rush into these kind of decisions. And then also one of the prerequisites is that you stay in a kind of community after, in order to train, right? Because becoming monk or nun is easy, right? It is just one day ritual, right? But to stay ordained and to train according to the discipline, that takes a little bit more effort. So for that purpose, it's very important to analyze well before taking the decision. So when you become monk or nun, then you, first of all, it has to come from yourself. You shouldn't be forced by somebody else, right? So it has to be a genuine motivation, yeah? And then based on this general motivation of understanding in the lamrim, or the stage of path to enlightenment, to a certain extent, then you make this decision. So the motivation is very essential, yeah? Then next to the motivation, but also essential is kind of having faith that the ritual is a kind of a very short ritual that establishes the vows, so to say, so that you have to have a discriminating factor. Oh, when the vow is established, now it's been established, right? And now, then you rejoice. And then His Holiness used to always tell that very clearly, that it's important to rejoice and be incredibly fortunate, because it's a kind of a lineage from Sakyamuni Buddha, right, all the way to the present, in an unbroken like of lineage of the vows for self-liberation. So that's quite a precious aspect of that ritual as well, to know that. And then know when you establish the vow, oh, now I'm a real kind of follower, so to say. Yeah. And yeah, I spent about, what is it, let's say, yeah, a little bit over 2 decades, right, in the monastic environment, in particular in Sera Monastic University, South India. Yeah, I mean, what it's like to live in a monastery, it's a quite, if I compare to university, it's more intense. The university I went to in the Netherlands, compared to what we do in the monastery, is quite an intense program, because you get up early and go to bed late. Of course, we had a little bit of siesta after lunch because hot climate, but it's quite intense with pujas, prayers, and then the study, and then especially the debate. And the debate is kind of a daily exam. So if you didn't study or memorize well that day, you're gonna have a hard time in a debate courtyard, right? So it's a very, and on top of that, you live with roommates, and there's no privacy at all. So for a Westerner, initially it can be quite challenging in this kind of big monastic institutions, right? Because you live with a roommate in quite a small room, and you go out and you're with your classmates, so you're always with people. So it's a very community kind of, so you have to get used to that, but it gives an incredible support. And the same thing we see, that it's much easier to study and keep going when that energy is high with a lot of people, right? So we see the similar things in the West with the various centers, right? The various Dharma centers we can go to and engage in study programs. It's very beneficial to do study programs on a much longer period of time than just do a little bit here and there, right? So then you see that the program itself and sometimes the centers, they can give the right support, you know? So that's, for the long term, you know, if you think about becoming a Buddha, then in our monastic system we always joke about, what about 2 decades of study, and then you put 2 decades into practice, and then you get somewhere. You do it over a few lifetimes, and then realizations come, right? Yeah. So starting in the beginning, coming in the monastery was quite a challenging kind of point, because language-wise, we behind, right? I studied a little bit of colloquial language in Dharmasala, but it's fast. Debate goes those high-speed language, right? So this initially was quite, the first 2 years was quite tough, And then of course, living in a completely different culture. And in those days, the conditions were not as good as it was now. We had just had a water pump. we didn't have a shower in our compound. So it was just a bucket wash in the early days. But then that was a bit, challenging. And then always living with others. You could never say, now I want to be by myself. That's not possible at all. And then another thing what was challenging in the beginning, but bringing great benefit on the long term, is that Tibetans are very good in teasing each other. And especially when it comes to the ego. So they used to, including my own roommates, they used to go so deep that just before you get angry. And then they should say, hey, look, there it's coming. So the more uptight you are, the more center of attention you become. And that's for us in the West, we never do that, right? But that's a very playful way of playing with the ego, and a very good way to let go. And that's the whole debate system is exactly like that. So it's not just an in-depth study, but its practice is right there. The practice about the mind is right there. So in that way, it was very, very helpful. And the culture itself is a very relaxed atmosphere, although it's very tense. But people know how to relax and work hard at the same time, and teasing each other and joking around, and that I learned a lot in the 20 years. Yeah, I think in the West, in general, when we have discussions, for example, in various centers, then sometimes people get too much about their own view, right? So it's good to have a discussion and be open, because somebody else might have a different interpretation you haven't thought about, right? So that gives you another insight. So that you learn in debate to be very open-minded. And that's what we in the West can do in a similar way, that we can be, more open in discussions and learn from others. That's one aspect. Another aspect is the long-term vision, right? In this kind of what I just said, is kind of in this long-term vision of having big goals, enlightenment, right? It's very fast, far away. And then you make plans. Okay, I do this study program, I do this, I do a little bit of retreat, and now and then. Yeah, so you have this vast vision of enlightenment. Then you make plans for this life, right? And you make prayers for future lifetimes to do similar. And then the third advice is to relax. Take it easy. Because if you have a vast plan and you have this incredible vast vision, then it's not gonna, you're not gonna change your mind overnight, right? So it's gonna take time, especially when you think about realizations. So then you think about, okay, I dedicate some time in study, and that is the plan. I dedicate some time in whenever I have time to do retreat. And then you think not only this life, you think you do that for a few lifetimes, and then things will happen, right? So that vision is very important to cut down this short-sighted kind of aspect we all walk around with, right? Even as Buddhists, we have quite a kind of short-sighted vision, especially in Western society, right? So the traditional way, it just disappears slowly over time, because you have this vast vision, you make plans, and that gives you to relax. And then it becomes a very enjoyable kind of way to study and put things into practice. Yeah.